thank you all for staying for the second panel session, which is titled The Promises of Student Inclusion in University and the Workplace. I will be your moderator, and discussing these promises today with you are Associate Professor Wendy from Charles Sturt University, Dr. Paula McMullen from University of Tasmania, Dr. Joanne Travaglia from University of New South Wales. Put your hand up. And yes, our very own, who left us to go to Griffith University, Associate Professor Jane Wilkinson. Now, we had a fun time emailing and even had a telephone conference, which was really great, seeing so busy academics taking time out for something like this. And we have come up and had to, after going all over the world with issues, coming back to focus on 4 promises. And they are about promises to non-traditional student groups, promises to industry and community partners, promises about employability and work readiness, and finally, promise to enhance critical thinking and citizenship. So the first promise, which I'll address to Jane to respond to, universities have generic student equity policies. They promise all students equal access to a rich university experience. How can universities live up to this promise in current times of increasing non-traditional student groups? Jane.
Right, thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Francisca, for inviting me here. Well, one of the key recommendations from the Bradley Review in 2008 was that universities increase the uptake of students from equity groups, that is so-called non-traditional background students. For universities such as Charles Sturt University or Griffith, where I'm now located, this goal is not a challenge. Both universities have a proud history of welcoming students from a range of so-called non-traditional backgrounds, and indeed many of the students I taught in education at Charles Sturt were the first in their families to attend university. In the late 1970s, I was also one of those students, a beneficiary of the Whitlam government's decision to get rid of university fees. However, there's a clear difference between welcoming such students and providing them with full access to the full range of pedagogical curriculum, assessment and social effective practices that engender full inclusion within the university community. In other words, universities may promise access to education through a range of access and equity schemes, but do they then deliver in terms of full participation, academically and socially? How can they live up to this promise in times when government funding for universities is now less than 50% and universities grapple with increasing revenue streams in areas such as recruitment of international students and grant income? Is it an impossible promise for Australian universities to live up to? I'm asking myself this question in the middle of writing a series of case studies based on data collected as part of an Office and Learning Teaching grant, which is examining successful school-to-university pathways for young students of refugee origin. And it involves colleagues from Charles Sturt University, University of Western Sydney and the University of Canberra. 3 universities that do have a proud record of welcoming students from a range of equity backgrounds. And what is it that we're learning from this study in regard to young people of refugee origin, one of the most disadvantaged groups entering Australian universities? And I stress that these are emerging findings, so please don't hold me to it completely. What appears to be happening is that there are services, but the services to cater to the distinctive learning needs of the many members of this group appear to be inconsistent, at times ad hoc, subject to short-term funding, and frequently lacking specialist staff. The university support staff, the academics, teachers and school support staff that we've interviewed emerged as enormously committed. They are aware that this is a group that requires greater levels of support academically and socially than other more so-called mainstream groups. What arises from this study, however, is that the promise of equal access to a rich university experience is not only about increasing funds, although we'd argue that this is a critical and necessary component. It's also about better coordination of existing services, devising flexible pathways that don't homogenise young people of refugee origin, provision of specialised and targeted academic, discipline-specific support, and finally, attention to building human relationships. And it's this human factor that emerges as most critical in supporting these young people to achieve full participation. And what was really striking was the difference that one or two staff members could make in the lives and educational opportunities of these young people. And I think it's really nicely encapsulated in the following quotation. And this is one of the general staff members talking here about what she's learned from working with students from Sudanese backgrounds. And she says, quote, "The Sudanese background students I've had contact with are more likely to ask for assistance when it's in a relaxed situation. The concept of making appointments, they've said to me, it makes it feel too formal. I just want a bit of a chat about the difficulty I'm having. They're more likely to raise a concern when they bump into you, or they'll just stick their head in to say, hello. A lot of the refugee students we've been working with come from a cultural background where community is that face-to-face contact and relationships are developed." And she says, it's through a relationship that you then seek help rather than a title. I love that quote, because I think that just captures so much of what we saw. That last sentence encapsulates a salient truth about increasing access to rich university experiences for all students, particularly those from non-traditional backgrounds. Without the implementation of specific interventions and strategies, the significant barriers experienced by young refugee people due to educational and economic barriers do not decrease over time. When the specific needs of low SES groups in education are conflated into a one-size-fits-all response, we risk perpetuating a lack of access and successful participation at university level. Conversely, programs which are tailored to the specific needs of particular student demographics are a crucial aspect of widening the access and participation of students from low SES backgrounds. For example, the University of Western Sydney has a record 23% of students from low SES origin, making it the largest of any university with low SES students in Australia. Its success has been attributed to its effective and varied pathways programs catering for the distinctive needs of varying groups of low SES students. What makes the difference to students such as the ones that have been described by that university support staff member when it comes to accessing a rich and full university education? How can universities live up to the promise of equal access to a rich university experience for non-traditional student groups? Well, they can continue to do what they did for, and what we see them doing at times for these particular students. That is, build thoughtfully designed bridging and linking programs, have early intervention programs that commence in the middle years of high school, that build strong connections with local schools and stakeholder communities. They can introduce immersion programs so that commencing students come into the university with at least some understanding of the cultural mores underpinning the foreign land of higher education. They can provide access to ongoing, coordinated and discipline-specific tutoring. They make sure that the students have consistent follow-up, and above all, they forge processes and strategies that build connections, human connections between students, other students and staff. And we know that some universities do this far better than others. So I'd like to encourage each of our institutions to do so, and to remember that this process also starts with each of us.
Hi Jane. As you were talking, I was thinking about the students kind of wandering in those informal situations, and wondering about the impact of casualisation in that space where you don't actually have people who are there all the time so that those things can actually happen serendipitously. Do you have anything to comment in that regard?
I'm not quite sure about that. It's a good question, but casualisation actually was raised more, Jenny, in terms of staff who may have access and contact with students not having access to the training and the consciousness raising and the kind of building the understandings of what they need to do. So it really came through more in that sense that staff were missing out, staff who were casuals were missing out on that kind of thing. And so one of the things that came through was the need to kind of build a community with sessional staff, and not to have them just out in the periphery, so to speak, being lost in terms of all the professional development opportunities that were there. But you raise an excellent point, because that's premised on the notion that it is ongoing staff who aren't just being paid by the hour.
The kinds of spaces that have been created in new buildings, I don't know whether you're having this sort of issue or whatever your university, but some of the new learning spaces where there's a lot of collaborative space for students into student relationship, but staff in those new spaces seem to be put behind closed doors, and I would imagine this would be of some impact, that student popping their head around a door, which in my university, or the campus of my university, is quite a common thing. It doesn't seem to be catered for in new kinds of learning and working space.
That's an excellent point, and it's because the students talked about the importance of just feeling comfortable with a lecturer and feeling that they were, or with a school, a professional staff member, feeling that they could just go in there in a kind of, and not behind those closed doors. But then, you know, you might say the same that old style universities that have corridors with doors that are shut and, you know, people are only available for certain consultation hours. I mean, that's incredibly intimidating as well. So, I mean, those structures have been around, but it's an excellent point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Just wanted to add, can you imagine what it's like for non-traditional students to try and do workplace learning and find a placement when we have a scarcity of placements? And I wonder if anybody in the panel wants to say something on that. Scarcity of placements and non-traditional students being included to find placements. Do you want to?
I can just comment that I was at a national meeting in November of workplace learning people in social work, and this issue was raised. And some of the universities, actually in other states, were saying that their host organisations say people have to have a certain level of English or we won't accept them. So the actual organisations are precluding some of these newcomers to universities. So there's just an enormous level of prejudice out there, but also economic reality of that they are getting students to get work done, and their perception is the work won't be done unless there's some prerequisites. So I think there's a lot of barriers. Sorry to be a bit gloomy about that.
I just, Jane, want to affirm the points that you've made. I support Indigenous students coming from rural and remote locations into our education degree. And the comments that you've made I want to reinforce, because for those particular students, the two key issues are flexibility of pathways and access into university, and the flexibility of the university to respond at that point of need to the students. And I guess, Wendy, from your point of view, just following up about the scarcity of placements, yes, those issues are there in the field, but I find if the university has fostered relationships with certain placements or placement centres or schools, etc., there are people out there who will support and give students a fair go in an environment that comes across in a cross-cultural situation, because the implications of that first placement are critical for everybody concerned, and will have a lasting impact on the students in the way that they are able to integrate into the Australian educational scene or health scene, etc.
No, I agree. There's enormous parallels, and one of the things that we've been doing is reading a lot of the literature around Indigenous students and the ways in which they move into and are included within the university settings, and we can see many parallels. Obviously there are differences too in terms of, I won't go into those, but yes, I agree. There's a lot of commonalities. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Moving on to the next promise. The promise that universities makes to industry and community partners. This is addressed for Wendy. The economic imperative and new government funding rules ask universities to be more relevant for society. One way of demonstrating this is through engagement with industry. Last month, Universities Australia, ASIN, and 3 Australian business and industry groups have signed a statement of intent to enhance workplace learning. Universities promise workplaces genuine partnerships. They claim to contribute to reflective practice and critical thinking in the workplace, provide easy recruitment. They promise to contribute to the future workforce through workplace learning programs and collaborate on sharing research interests. What needs to be in place so that universities can live up to these value-adding promises to industry?
Thanks, Francisca. Well, in my 3 minutes that I have, I thought I'd break this into two questions. And in good university tradition, I guess my first question is why? Why is there such a focus on university industry partnerships for workplace, work-integrated learning? And what happened to community and society and good citizenship for democracy? Is that being silenced? So I suppose that's my first question. Tony Harland asked yesterday, does the economy need critically educated people or simply a set of industry-ready skills with the right attitudes to work? And then went on to talk about this wonderful idea of slow scholarship. When I looked at the statement of intent, and as you said, Francisca, it had 2 really important educational peak bodies and 3 industry bodies. But when you look at what all the objectives are and the benefits that are spelled out there, it looked to me as though it's all about what industry needs, not so much about what universities need. And there's nothing there about citizenship, democracy, community, giving to the community. And of course, this is about university industry partnerships, and I recognise that it's aimed to increase the levels of workplace learning placements, which we've already said there's a scarcity of. So, you know, of course there's political intent behind this statement, but nevertheless, there is a silent space there where there's no community engagement. We've had wonderful examples about how Will can do other things just in this 2 days, Will being work-integrated learning. The presentation by Felicity Rawlings about Macquarie Uni and their professional and community engagement projects, both here and overseas. And we've also had some marvellous ideas. Sandra Wills and Jana Rell's notion about career-ready graduates rather than work-ready graduates, I think is a wonderful idea. I just wanted to unpack that statement of intent a little bit, because there's a great quote in it. Just let me find it. Okay, so it finishes off, you know, with a flourish. Developing our skill base and relationships with many of the world's best and brightest provides opportunities to strengthen our future in research, innovations, business opportunities, and the development of specialist networks. Will provides many opportunities for Australia. Okay, good points. But I ask, and this leads me to the second part of the question, how can we do this when most of the so-called best and brightest in our universities have nothing to do with work-integrated learning, and large parts of our work-integrated learning staff are relegated to the precariat that Tony Harland mentioned yesterday? And I was we conducted some research about this across Australia in social work as part of an OLT grant, and found that many of the universities were saying that their academic positions to assess and to liaise with the industry partners are sessional staff on short-term contracts who are not invited into any of the decision-making meetings, any of the planning or the curriculum design, and don't get a say about any of that, or even much of really a formal opportunity to feed back. And just as we heard this morning, the industry partners, we all think it's a great idea to involve them, but are we actually doing that? That's the question. I know in my case, I did have a consultative body with industry many years ago, but we all ran out of time and it vanished, and we haven't got it back. We do have industry partners at course level advising us, but the really important notion of involving our industry partners in how we plan our will, I think at the formal levels that's gone by the board in a lot of cases. Maria, I really loved your point about relationship, and I think that is just so important. And I believe there are a lot of really good partnerships and relationships going on, but they're at the very informal level largely in will still. And partly that's because the universities are on the way to making will a lot higher priority, but we haven't got there yet. I think there's a huge amount still to do. I had loads more notes here from what other people had said, but I think we perhaps should throw it open to ask about how do we actually get better partnerships, and what about the community, and what do we do about that? Jane?
My reading around any of the research around partnerships says that they're most effective when they're long-term. That it does take a long time to build them up, and they're multifaceted. So much of some of these promises that I think are dangerous because I don't think many of them are feasible at this point for a university to make, and they create false expectations amongst employers and amongst students. And I think if we move to looking at what would be an authentic, mature relationship with some organisations, both industries and community, I think they're all feasible, but they take a long time, and they should incorporate both research, service and education, because they're the three responsibilities of universities, but somehow we sort of put them to one side and make it about student placements. And I think that's that sort of siloing to that very narrow thing, and work ready, which I'm beginning, maybe I'm just getting too old now, but I'm beginning to find that term offensive the more I hear it. And the real world, which infers that we're not real world, and work ready, I think they're the things that undermine the partnership rather than build them.
I think the declaration was to some extent a political statement, and it did kind of read as if nothing had been happening, which of course isn't the case at all. So I don't think we should overread the UA statement in relation to what's really happening with work integrated learning even in universities, which is not to say it's not important, but I think for those people who have been deeply embedded in the field for a long time, I wouldn't take too much alarm from the press release.
But I still think that we tend to get rooted by it, and
I find, maybe I'm just getting old too, but the work ready thing really annoys me actually. One thing I've dug out is I have a letter that Frederick Handley Page, who was an English aircraft manufacturer, wrote in 1934 saying, well, there's no point getting a fresh graduate. We know that they would be useless until they've been working for 3 years. So, again, it's another one of these things that has been I'm sure there must be a tablet somewhere criticising Plato's Academy on the same grounds. It's something that's been around ever since education has happened. So I think it's not a new feature, and it falls apart in your hands if you try and specify it.
Well, the press release, yes, fine to have a political statement about work readiness, etc. We also need press releases about citizenship, about community contributions, about giving to the community, and that's the sort of leadership we need as well.
Well, I think Universities of Australia says all those things. This was a press release out of the entire suite of things that it said, and as I said, it's certainly, I don't want to trivialise the initiative or anything else that UA does, because they're doing quite well, but it was about filling a particular hole in the discourse. It wasn't meant to be the totality of the discourse about what universities contribute or what industry does.
And that's really important too. Yeah, my job's to be provocative, so I'm doing my best here.
I'd like to provoke work ready as well. I think that we should change the definition, not just chuck out the word, because there's a lot of... we don't want to graduate people who are academically irrelevant to the world of work, but we also want to say that to be a good worker, we also need to be good citizens. Yeah. So I want to put the citizenship into work readiness rather than throw the term out altogether.
Especially when we're having socially responsible organisations and all of that. Yeah, very important.
Wendy, I hear that you're trying to get a bit of a discussion around community, interfacing with community, but I wondered whether part of that is also to what extent does industry these days do good for the community, and is that sort of feeding back into this process, because is it maybe a university industry partnership that should be engaging with and for want of a better word, serving community or feeding back into the community, and perhaps that presents a barrier?
I think that is exactly what's happening in a lot of these student placements, that organisations are asking the students to do the things that they don't have the time to do, special placements. And if I can just give one example of that, we had an office of Centrelink in Wagga that was taking our social work students back to back, year after year, to do really innovative projects that became national parts of what Centrelink did, because the social workers, that wasn't in their job descriptions, but they knew these things needed to be done. And they were quite, some of them were quite radical, progressive initiatives that then turned out to be a great idea, and the organisation took on board. And we've had students do quite extraordinary things that have turned agency policy around with the blessing of the organisations, because they wanted to be improving their practice, I suppose you'd say. We've had students discovering, lots of clients say that have been underpaid, and the organisation turning around then and repaying these clients who could then afford a house for the first time in their lives. Things like this. So it's very serious work that they do, and I think it's a lot about social justice and things. That's a real role that work integrated learning can play, and that organisations welcome.
Moving on to the next promise, and this is for Paula. Universities promise students that they graduate with high employability. And further, they tend to make implicit claims that a university qualification, rather than crafts-based learning or industry-based training, is the ticket for the bright career in the future. However, emerging statistics demonstrate that a high number of graduates do not find employment in their studied field of practice. Should universities make this promise about employability and, dare I say, work readiness?
Thank you, Francesca. I have a very health background, so this may be centred a bit too much, but I look at some of the unrealistic expectations that they give our students, a lot to do with clinical placements as well. So I'll break in and talk a little bit about clinical placements, because when we talk about work ready, they often will say, well, how much clinical practice placement have you done? And if you work in the area which I do, which is with paramedicine, is in Amanda, who spoke earlier about policing, you know, the lure of lights and sirens and driving fast, neither of which we have in our programs. But then you look at nursing as well, where they have the, you know, RPA and, you know, as days gone by, a country practice. But, you know, those sort of shows have glamorized some of these healthcare professions, and it has done to me a great disservice to what the jobs really are. And a bit of the work readiness, though, does talk about clinical placements, and I will be quite controversial here, and especially with the VC here, it's not going to like this, but it was mentioned earlier about, you know, one of the universities taking on a tremendous number of nursing students as well. There seems to be a lot of notions that we will take on hundreds to thousands of nursing students, paramedic students as well, pre-teaching services, I think another area where this has taken place. Yet we know there are no jobs waiting for them. I can tell you in 2014 we have over 5,000 undergraduate paramedic students in Australia alone. 1,800 are in their final year. Now even if you calculate a bit of attrition and say we've got 1,500 paramedics graduating, there's 6 employers of paramedics in Australia, which is the state-run ambulance services. There's not that much attrition. So we are taking in these students, and we have to make it very clear, at least from my perspective from my universities, we tell them, you're not going to have a job. And I know they do similarly for like nursing as well. But it's very discouraging for a student when you're talking to them in their orientation or first week. So they're saying, great, we want you to come on and throw everything into it. Oh, but by the way, you may not have a job at the end. And only the best are going to get the jobs at the end. And yet how do we do that? As we've talked a lot about in the last 2 days, is what's your grade point average? And that usually means how competent are you, technically competent are you. Not necessarily do you have the graduate skills that we talk about, because we don't measure them in any of our assessment tasks, in our arm of assessments. So I think that is something that's quite tricky. I know the issue as well as being employability. The employers do want you to have the clinical placements. Yet, if you look at Queensland, I'm again speaking about paramedics because it's a good one to point out because it's the sexy profession to start at your university. CSU's had it for a while, so they've been, I think, through the rounds. 7 universities now in Queensland are taking up paramedicine. Where are they? Now, the problem is the Queensland Ambulance Service say, no, we can't give you any clinical placements. Vic Uni is very similar. They're taking over 400 students a year. And so a lot of their clinical placements do involve, oh, you're going to drive 2 hours to Shepparton and do an 8-hour shift and then come back. So there's a lot of inconsistencies. I think we do give students a lot of false promises, and that does not make them road ready. And I think they're just things that we need to look at, as well as people say, well, simulation. It's very difficult, though. How do you simulate working with other agencies? Working with the police when you have to take down someone, or at a road accident, working with the SES, the Rural Fire Department. You know, working with the coroner when you have to go to someone who's deceased in a home. It's not just necessarily the inter-hospital. We often talk about interprofessional learning, but there's also multi-agency that we don't even talk about because they're not even trained, so to speak. Some of them are just your voluntary, your rural fire and volunteer SES. So there are other things that we need to be incorporating. I'm very scared that we're going to lose this work, If we don't have that, I think our students will be sorely disadvantaged, which will then make it even that much more difficult for them getting into career aspirations. And getting back to what was said earlier as well, is we need to look at too that we should call them as that we all hate, I think, the word work ready. Is that we need to look at it as a career ready, and that we need to look at that partnership, which has also been discussed about, so that they realize it's not an us and them anymore. I think that is the one thing that we've really got to get away from, is this us and them. Well, you say you're training them and we're actually doing all the work. This is me talking when I used to work in the hospital side of things, and it goes both ways. But I think we have to realize that we're all in it together, and the stuff that's been generated over the last 2 days has been phenomenal about the partnerships from all different angles and how can you make that work, because we have to go in with the solutions focus. We can whinge all we want about how the system's not right. What we do have to do is find the solutions, and that's why I'm hoping today, and what we've done over the last 2 days, is we can start finding those solutions.
Another controversial possible strategy. Universities could educate academically ready graduates if there's not enough workplace placements. I had this discussion with one industry in the past, and they said, yes, no, you must do it. Oh, but we don't have enough placements, we're not going to take them anymore, our CEOs won't let us, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And they said, okay, we'll educate the graduates with academic readiness but not work readiness, and it's up to you then. Oh, no, we won't do that either. So the answer was, we'll just get them from interstate. So stuff you, but we're not going to help you. It didn't actually end up coming to grips with that, to that final point, but there are options. We can simulate people to death to send them out there. They can't talk to anyone. They faint at the first sight of a funny smell, and things like this, because they haven't had the work placements. But then the pressures on the industry partners or community partners, people who are offering places, is also escalating as well. So I'm actually contributing to the problem rather than helping it, but I think we need to be careful not to go to extremes in solutions as well.
I know some of the things that we've been looking at as well with this is, what do we do with these graduates if they don't have positions? And I know what a lot of people are looking at is, encourage them to do postgraduate follow-on work, looking at doing honours, or steer them towards the research focus as well, and to also tell people that not everything has to be solely industry-driven. So we do try to think of other ways of keeping the student connected. And I think that's another thing about when you look at your alumni is how do we interject and interact with our own alumni from our universities? Are we actually tapping into those resources as well when we talk about integrated work learning?
I'm just interested in possible links between the difficulty in finding student placements and the difficulty in graduates finding jobs, and whether the areas where you have difficulty finding student placements turn out to be the areas where there aren't enough jobs for your graduates when they get out into the workplace. Is there a link there?
I don't think so necessarily. I think, unfortunately, when I look at a lot of the healthcare things, is you're educated to be a specific discipline. So whether it's nursing, and I think that some of the other issues that many people have is that we want to encourage interdisciplinary learning, but then I'm using paramedics a lot, but it can be transferred to a lot of different areas. If we send paramedics into the hospital, I think it's a fantastic idea. It lets them see the continuum of care. They get to see that it's not just the pre-hospital, out-of-hospital care side of it, and through to patients to discharge. But the hospitals reply back as often, well, what do we get out of this? We're teaching your paramedics. And it's like, it's a bigger picture than that. And I think we have to go back to that patient-centered care and see that it's a continuum. So as for getting back to your original question of the competition or there's no jobs, I think we're also seeing the same thing with nursing as well, that there are limited jobs out there for graduate nurses as well. Whether this will change, as we've all been told about the big baby boom and we're all going to be gone, or our generation will be setting off into the sunset, I'm not so sure. The turnaround for paramedics is less than 5 years. I said it's about 3.8 years, I think, that they leave the job. But yet we're not seeing that attrition, though, on paper. So, and I think with nursing, it's a similar sort of scope. There's a lot of nurses out there who are hanging out to retire, but don't know that the jobs are still there. But I know they're still recruiting overseas at times.
Look, I just wondered on the 400 students that are coming out each year or thereabouts, there seems to be not just paramedicine or nursing, but very much across many courses. And you were just talking about it then. But how, it is the white elephant in the room, do you know what I mean? But really it sort of needs to get tackled across university, in every university. How flexible are courses like paramedicine to be able to maintain the content, but perhaps go into other courses to reduce student numbers for several years and then to ramp up again as required? Does that make sense? I'm saying, so you don't want to lose you don't want to keep on putting out 400 students a year, but you don't want to lose the expertise and the course content. Can this go into be, driven into other areas where there is a demand and then gather,
I think there is, especially in some of the fields that are cross. You look at nursing and paramedicine. Probably certain people can transgress over and do a nursing degree, and possibly some go on to do medicine. But usually, the higher end students will get the jobs. It's the ones that may not graduate at the higher level. I know there's a lot of controversy at the moment of do you cap your undergraduate placements? So that's why a lot of universities are taking in as many undergrads as they possibly can, so that they do get capped. And you don't necessarily want to be stuck to the supply and demand and be told how many students you can and can't take in. I don't know if there is a particular answer because so many degrees are so geared towards their specialty. I don't know how well, or it ends up probably just being an extension of some students' degrees. So it would have been a 3-year degree. They might end up having a 4 or 5 year degree that might be like dual badged, which you may see that might get them into another area. So they might choose to possibly go into teaching or something like that, where they can diverse. I think that's something else that we should be looking at within universities, is not necessarily being all rigidly within maybe the domains of science, that you could have a dual degree with education and a science degree.
The whole competitive space is really interesting because one of the reasons it's happened was a view that universities would benefit from a bit of a shake-up and would benefit from more competition, but it is playing out problematically, I think. I just saw the story this morning that UWS is going to build a high-rise campus for 10,000 students in Western Sydney, and there may well be the demand there. But CSU started with paramedics, UWS are doing it, UTAS is huge in New South Wales, in fact, in terms of offering paramedics as well. So the trouble is a university runs a successful course and everybody else looks around and goes, I'll have some of that as well. And then we end up with overcapacity. So I don't know that one of the issues the sector is going to have to face up to is I don't know we've yet learnt how to do competition. There's quite a bit of, appears to me to be a huge amount of investment in capacity. And there may be some elements of market failure that come out of this, which may bring caps back. But you're dead right. Universities are enrolling for fear that when caps come back on, they might get short. They might otherwise be left out. So, but the other thing I was going to say is, I think a function of competition in the commercial space, because it's life in commercial enterprises has become very much harder over the last few decades as well. Is training's been squeezed out. So the training they used to do in-house, they're not willing to pay for anymore because their margins have been squeezed. And then you end up with these conversations, and same with government departments, and then you end up with these conversations about, we're not paying for it. There's a standoff in New South Wales at the moment about health placements, and there's a stand-up, there will be I think that coming with teacher placements as well. And, there's elements of cost shifting between state and federal levels, given the money that's supplied. So the whole thing is getting a lot more complicated and a lot more problematic, and probably won't be solved very quickly, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
With wider participation of people in university education, there is increasing student diversity. And further, most students need to work to fund their studies. They are time jealous and almost resist thinking for self. In the digital age, we are pushed to swap physical with virtual engagements with students. There's a global trend buoyed by depersonalization of care, a risk-averse society, and quality promise to enhance critical thinking and reflective spaces for students. How can universities deliver on this promise? Jo.
I'm going to start from the premise of Danny Dorling's lovely adage that anecdote is the singular of data. I want to start with my anecdote, which is basically that I trained in the late 70s, early 80s in one of the two critical schools of social work in Australia. There was University of Sydney and University of Queensland, surprisingly enough. And for those of you who don't know, radical or critical schools of social work were basically Marxist schools of social work. And at the end of 4 years, what I left with was an incredibly valuable education in terms of critical thinking, both capital C and lower C, and virtually no traditional social work skills whatsoever, despite 3 extensive placements. And that's a question that has intrigued me for several years, for most of my career. Did it matter? Does the world need one not very good social worker? Does the world need more critical thinkers? My perspective would lead to both, I think. But I'd like to talk today about the critical thinking part, because I think it's one of the things that I grapple with quite a lot in my current work. At the moment, I'm the head of the health management program in the Faculty of Medicine at University of New South Wales, and being a non-doctor in a Faculty of Medicine is quite an interesting experience. It's almost like going back to the postmodernist days. It's quite interesting. The reason I think philosophy and critical thinking are incredibly important for someone who, like myself, did not train in philosophy, I did about 1 year, is that I see every day of my working life students butt up against deep epistemological and ontological questions without the language to discuss these. So I will go into a tutorial group where they're discussing the delivery of services, and the issue at hand is whether or not we should provide services to people who refuse to smoke, to stop smoking, or refuse to lose weight. What you see within about 15-20 minutes is a debate that splits people between categoricalists, utilitarians, and virtue ethicists. But very few of those people have that language, or to know that their position comes from those stances. For me, it matters. It matters because they think that they're arguing on the basis of logic, not realising that they're arguing on the basis of ideology. And I think that's something that occurs all the time. Second example that I strike constantly is the belief in medical students that randomised control trials are the gold standard of all forms of information and evidence. And asking them questions like, who's included in a randomised control trial? Who's left out? What alternative sources of knowledge occur? How do those randomised control trials constructed, and what does the evidence say when the patient in front of you doesn't meet the guidelines in any way? Again, they look at you, especially the medical students, not the public health students who come from a diverse background. The medical students look at you somewhat askance. The third example I'd like to use is an interesting one. We're getting more and more applicants for PhDs who are very intelligent, very clever, very well educated people who have no known discipline background. So they're going into data collection and analysis without a framework. And I've got to say here, and I hope the video's off, partially to blame is the whole rise of grounded theory. If I have one more student come to me and say, I really want to do a grounded theory thesis, I think I will scream, because what they really mean, and it's not their fault, is not that they want to do another grounded theory thesis. What they want to do is a thesis without theory. And I think we're partially responsible in academia for that, but not entirely. And I think that those sort of issues, those sort of underlying reflective issues that require critical thinking, both capital C and lower C, are the kind of skills that translated, as we saw yesterday with Tony's speech, into the kind of qualities that people talk about. They're about self-reflexivity, they're about positioning, they're about the I word, ideology, they're about that really old-fashioned word that we used to use in social work in the 80s, which is, what stance do you take? And people do take stances, and they use ideology to make decisions, and they inform their decisions by all sorts of pieces of information that may be valid or not valid, or valid within certain parameters and not valid within other parameters. And the glowing example to me that I think academia is not yet engaged with is the whole shift to person-centered care. And I think there's a whole debate to be had around that is important for our students and ourselves in terms of research, because philosophically and in terms of practice, everybody says, yes, that's a fantastic idea, except those of us who have been involved know that person-centered and person-directed care is also part of a neoliberal agenda to shift money away from service providers and into the wider hand of private providers. That then has repercussions. So the question that we're saying, what do we do with 1,800 paramedics or 18,000 paramedics? Well, look at the baby boomers. There's an ageing population out there that requires specialist care. Increasingly, we're not going to be able to put people into nursing homes because very few people are going to be able to afford nursing home practice. There's whole other worlds of service delivery and provision that we need to think about. And sometimes, and please understand that I've worked with industry and with the community my entire life, I suspect that industry and community reflect the kind of biases that all human beings reflect, which is expressing their needs in terms of wants. And I think part of the role that academia has to play is to actually look at the needs as opposed to the wants, because people are very good at expressing what they think they want, but not necessarily very good at expressing how that match up between the individual student or provider is in terms of what the issues are in wider society. So just sort of a couple of things that I was thinking about, and to kind of, in a way, hark back to Jane's first premise. One of the issues that I do work with a lot is in terms of culture and diversity in organisations. And the critical thinking, I think, has to go 360 degrees. So Tony's question about assessment is one that we've been looking at in terms of Indigenous students. And one of the interesting things is thinking about whether they necessarily, or any other group or any other individual, have to go through the same form of assessment as everybody else. Is there an equity issue if we choose different forms of assessment that better suit individual people, which comes back to our question around mastery? So for our Indigenous students, and we have the largest number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander medical students and largest numbers of public health students, one of the things that we found is that Viva Voce actually fit Aboriginal interactions better than sitting down and writing a 2-hour exam. Now, it's a really interesting, and again, I hope the video's not on, it's a really interesting process of negotiation in the way that Tony was talking about, because we've got to be really quiet about that, because all of a sudden, if you say, well, we've actually got 2 forms of assessment, and one applies to one group, although we would be happy to extend it to anybody who wanted to do it, there's always those concerns around, you know, equity and solidarity. But what we're finding is that sort of critical thinking, reflective back on our own approaches, and what we use assessment for is letting us get kind of new ways of interacting with our students. So, I mean, I guess for me, I stand before you, I sit before you as a failed social worker, but a quite successful critical thinker, I think. And I really do think that some of the questions that we have to ask are deeper, and I know this group is, than are we matching the graduate to the workplace, to the community? Because I think the reality is, and my faculty hates to hear that, what we produce is not doctors. What we produce is medical graduates. You know, law schools produce law graduates. They don't produce lawyers. A doctor is something palpably different to a medical graduate, and a lot of my friends who are doctors say that's because the nurses slapped them around for a couple of years, and and rightly so. But it is a palpably different thing to become what embodies that professional being to what we actually produce in terms of graduation. And I think that what we can produce most effectively at the point of graduation is individuals who have a range of skills that can look out there and see how they can contribute to the world. Because one of the things that really terrifies me about the focus on MOOCs and technology and service delivery is that we will now be led by technologies that by the time we produce students will be outdated anyway. Thank you.
Wow. That deserves a clap. Anybody want to dare to respond to that? You talk too long. But yeah, here we go.
I was actually really proud that you said that about the oversupply and the need to go into things like aged care and look at those, because my mum's in aged care and most of her aged care providers are actually nurses from developing countries whose countries are doing without them. Yes. So we can be satisfied that our aged care people are getting it. But we've got graduates of nursing who can't get into a graduate program because there aren't the supervisions in aged care to do that because of funding. So it's a policy type thing.
I think the ethics of obviously overseas attracting, and also the experience of overseas trained health professionals in Australia is something that's, again, under research. I think that's one of the issues that we do have to consider.
When we think about all students doing the same thing, we're thinking about everybody starting on the same line.
Yes.
And students don't start on the same line. There's all different starting points. Yeah. If you're the first in your family, it's very different if you go home to a family where you've got professionals and professors in the household that have been to university. Yeah. So provided you know what you're trying to achieve, if you can find out they're achieving it in a different way that's more appropriate to their particular culture, I think that's absolutely fine. I wouldn't hide it. I think we need to make them very public so it becomes accepted practice.
I think I agree, and you know, I guess hiding it is probably too strong a word, but there are the politics around differentiation in terms, and for the reasons that we were talking about yesterday, the desperate need to get the highest grades possible results in all sorts of different issues.
I come from the UK, where still that undergraduate degree does not have the same focus on employability and vocation. It doesn't have the same vocational focus. And so still disciplines like, dare I say, English, history, are still considered high value degrees because of the intellectual rigour and the discipline and the critical thought that goes with them. And I think what I'm hearing being articulated here is one of the dangers about focusing on employability rather than looking at what the purpose of the academy is, the purpose of going through a kind of learning experience at higher education.
Yeah, and I think what happened when we moved to sort of more postgraduate professional qualifications, that was one of the values that I sought, that if people went into postgrad medicine, that undergrad they could do a whole range of things, but the reality is that some of them do, but most of them stick to courses that will prepare them for medicine, and so they're still quite narrow. And I'm not sure how, I think that's going to be one of the struggles, is how do you fight that? I mean, UNSW has a requirement for general education courses, so everyone has to do some general education courses before they graduate, and there's a lot of complaining about that, but I still think it's a really valuable outcome.
Please thank our panel.